Thank you, Volker, and thank you all for attending today. And it's always a pleasure to have the opportunity to present work to a diverse audience. And I think we're coming together with an interest in how technology is changing society. And I'm hoping that this hour we'll have together will be worth your time and an interesting conversation. Let me just take a second to set myself up. I'm going to share my screen and then I'm going to start. So, I'm going to present a working paper, and I'd love to hear your feedback and responses to it, especially from a multidisciplinary point of view. And I will start with a brief introduction to introduce some of the work I've been doing and kind of frame it and put it in context. Please feel free to jump in, interact. You can use the chat for that, but you can also simply unmute your mic and start talking. If also raising your hands is fine. I have the participant panel in front of me. Anything is good. So let me start with a question, just to make it a bit engaging at the beginning. This is a picture of a drill, clearly, and it's a reference to a famous marketing kind of dictum or mantra. So let's see if anyone here has taken marketing courses before and can guess what this is about. Any business student or marketing professors? No? I think Volker is shaking his head, so I'm gonna share this. It's almost a cliche in marketing. So this is what we often use. It's actually a statement from a Harvard professor from long ago. And he said, people don't buy drills. What they do is that they buy holes. And so the idea would be that as a company, what you need to focus on is not so much what you do, but what you do for the customer. That ultimately the important thing is not the attribute, but the benefit. And I think this is basically, what we teach in Marketing 101 to 18-year-olds joining college. And yet, I think it is an interesting point of view to bring to the conversation around artificial intelligence. Because we focus so much on the technology, we often tend to maybe lose sight a little bit of the human experience of AI and what that technology looks like from the point of view of the user, from that side, not from our side, the tech side. So this is just one example of, I think, the sort of mindset shift that I think it will be informative for a lot of discussions around artificial intelligence, whether that is about the business value of AI or policy kind of questions, where maybe sometimes what we need to do is not only looking at AI, what it does, what it can do, what it cannot do, and so forth, but also look at the experience of AI and what kind of customer experiences do AI create and generate for customers, and how are those lived. And I think that can give a lot of insights into AI deployment, barriers to adoption, customer satisfaction, and potentially also threats to consumer welfare. Just to introduce a topic, I'll share here the graphical representation of a framework that we published some years ago, trying to make exactly that point that I was just making, saying, there is value in taking an experiential perspective to AI. And so in that paper, we sketch 4 different customer experiences related to AI. We take a broad view on AI. We see AI more as an ecosystem, including also data collection processes and output systems. But basically, taking all of that in consideration, we argue that really there are a bunch of different experiences. We focus on 4, which we think explain quite a lot of customer reactions to AI in the marketplace. One we call it data capture experience, the experience of having your data taken with varying degree of consent by companies for the purpose of enabling and training AI systems. We have the classification experience, which most obviously applies to recommender systems of any kind, when basically you are now seeing content being served to you, whether those are social media posts or product recommendation on an e-commerce platform. They might be sometimes taken by customers that are a sign of how the company views a customer. And those can be positive or negative, of course. Then we have delegation experiences. These are basically the experience of co-creating some outcomes with an autonomous product, whether that is a software product or a physical product like a robotic appliance or a self-driving vehicle or whatever. And then we have social experiences, which is the experience of reciprocal interaction with a non-human agent, which is something that we really never had before. We do have the ability to communicate somewhat with other life forms like our pets, but I think what chatbots and other technology like language models can do today is way past what you can do in conversations with other life forms. So it's really quite special, and we never had that before. For each of these four experiences, we sketch the sociological and psychological background, and based on that, we try to detail psychological tensions that might emerge during those experiences. So the data capture experience can help you feel served when you believe that your data is surrendered with consent and it is being used to improve the quality of services you receive, but it can often also lead to you feeling exploited as a commodity, essentially. The classification experience can help you feel understood, but can also make you feel misunderstood and stereotyped and excluded or whatever. If I'm, for example, person of a particular gender who feels targeted based on their gender rather than their richer, collection of attributes. The delegation experience can make you feel empowered, enables you to do more with the time and the money you have, but also it might help you feel replaced if you feel threatened by the technology doing now things that you thought only you could do. And so we'll return to that issue of replacement in the rest of this talk. And then finally, the social experience. It's basically a social experience. It's a very special type of delegation experience where the outcome being co-created is a conversation. And so now you might feel connected because the company now is able to serve you in a way that's much more natural and personable, but might also make you feel alienated if you feel you've been now not seen and not heard by people, but only being served by bots. These are just a few examples, but I just wanted to point you to this paper as just one example of the kind of work you can do when you take this behavioral and experiential perspective on AI, which is one that, until quite recently was quite rare in conversations around AI. So one pitch, I would like to plug here, our center, AI at Wharton, is part of a big new initiative at the Wharton School called the AI and Analytics Initiative. And what we do is that we organize conferences, we fund research, we collect data about industry adoption, we communicate about research and promote work by our researchers and so forth. This is just one example. We have our second annual conference on generative AI coming up at our San Francisco campus at the beginning of September. We have a great set of speakers, including a keynote by Eric Bjornsson, and we're looking forward to hosting people from a lot of different fields, including economics, information systems, marketing, psychology, that are coming together to talk about the impact of Gen AI on business. And so that's a QR code if you're interested in checking out our content on the website. We also do a conference in the spring. We did one on AI and the future of work, just as an example for those of you interested in more organizational issues. Now, the broader point that all of this kind of thing amounts to is a call for thinking of AI not purely as a technical subject or an engineering subject for computer scientists, but to think of it now as a social science topic. And I think that perspective is crucial for a number of reasons. First, because our interactions with this technology are becoming very social, or at least parasocial, in that we're really using a lot of the apparatus and cognitive functions that we developed to interact with other humans now to interact with machines. So social science becomes naturally informative of human machine interaction in this context, obviously, but also because as AI becomes ubiquitous and gets deployed across all kind of context in society at great speed, and oftentimes in a somewhat of a regulatory vacuum, I think it is becoming crucial also to have a social science perspective to try to anticipate how things might actually, become problematic. And so just to make an example, there's a lot of conversations around AI bias. For example, the fact that AI predictions or AI systems might sometimes replicate some of the discriminatory or biased patterns that are observed in human behavior and therefore in the training data that are used to train these models. And that problem is often seen as a technical issue, which is how do we eliminate bias from the training data? Or if we really can't do that, how do we correct AI outputs, so to speak, post-production, post-processing, just to make sure that we don't have outputs that are problematic? And I'll argue that while that perspective is important, and that's a problem that is sometimes difficult to solve, but well understood, in fact, I believe that there are many other ways in which bias can creep into AI outcomes, which are not really about the training data. And they are oftentimes about the interaction between algorithmic decision-making and human decision-making. They emerge as a result of market forces, adoption patterns, and so forth. And so without a social science perspective, without a behavioral science perspective, it is basically impossible to either diagnose or address those forms of bias. This is just one example. I already made a few. Okay, I hope to have persuaded you, if I needed to, that social scientists have something important to offer to the conversation about AI. And before I delve into the paper I wanted to discuss today, I'll highlight one stream of research that some of you might find interesting that is very much in that vein. And this is a work that I've done over a period of multiple papers in about a decade. And we summarized it last year in Harvard Business Review feature article that you can probably easily find on the web. But there we argue that AI is affecting our sense of self, our identity, in ways that are quite fundamental and that are quite important to understand both patterns of user adoption in consumer markets, but also at the workplace, in our professional identities. And so there's a lot of attention to what people think about AI. Do they trust AI? Do they think AI does a good job or not? And I believe we also need to shift a little bit that mindset to almost thinking about AI as a mirror and thinking how does AI change the way we think about ourselves and what makes us special and what makes us unique and valuable and so forth. What gives us meaning in life. Grand kind of maybe statements, but I think there's a lot of concrete effects and ideas that are actually quite implementable from both a consumer markets and policy point of view. Volker, thank you for sharing the link in the chat. All right, now, a lot of the conversations around AI, especially when you think about fears that consumers have and that the media amplify, oftentimes have to do with human replacement. And a lot of that ultimately is about jobs and threat to jobs. And I have nothing to say really about what the impact of AI on labor markets is going to be. I read the literature, but I'm not a labor economist, and I essentially at this point nobody really knows. We know there's going to be some disruptions, but typically what you observe is that it's quite easy to see which jobs are being threatened by new technology, but it is always very difficult to tell which new jobs are being created by the same new technology. So we don't know at this point what AI is going to do to demand for labor. But regardless of that, I think there's a lot of conversations in society about the impact of AI on jobs. And so those conversations might inform consumer decisions and voting patterns and stuff like that. So I think it's an important phenomenon to study. And I'm going to present a paper. I picked this paper because I thought might be of interest to scholars from quite a few different disciplines. So I thought perhaps it was suitable for an audience like this one. And this is work I'm doing together with the German-speaking team. We have Armin from Munich, and from the Brand University of Applied Science, and Christoph from Vienna. And this is work that we are in the process of revising for another round of review. And so any feedback would be much appreciated. Okay, so let me start by framing the topic. This is a picture of the last 3 presidents of the United States. And these are people who, didn't very much agree on a lot of things, especially the one in the middle versus the other 2. And but they all agree on one thing. and that one thing is a dislike for the business practice of offshoring, or the moving of labor activities overseas in order to benefit from arbitrage opportunities, basically lower labor cost and a reduced cost of production. So, for example, Biden has this Made in America tax plan, a number of initiatives that are meant to incentivize firms to keep production in the United States, or home shore or backshore, whatever label you like to use, to bring production back into the home country through tax incentives, and so both sticks and carrots. And you see conversations of this sort, a tendency to oppose and try to minimize activities about offshoring. These conversations are not just in the United States, they're taking place across the rich world. And this is true for, also a lot of European kind of political conversations. And so I think it is interesting to study this as a social scientist for a number of reasons. The first one is that consumers are increasingly aware of companies' production decisions, especially ones that have a major impact on communities, because of social media, because of mobile phones, the availability of information, especially from local market. You will hear about a collective layoff decision, and especially if that is due to offshoring, that might easily reach consumers, with implications for attitudes towards firms and customer behavior. But also because by understanding consumer reactions to offshoring and generally collective layoff decisions, you might also be able to inform more like a political kind of conversations about about the kind of incentives that governments ought to put in place. Okay, so just an example from Europe, here from Germany. This is a story from The Guardian already, a couple of years ago. They were reporting on Adidas bringing production back to Germany after having made sneakers in Southeast Asia for about 40 years. And obviously, this is welcomed by German media and German citizens. All good, we're bringing factories back. And I suspect that a lot of the consumers and citizens that are favored and excited about news of this kind fail sometimes to realize that the factories that are coming back look nothing like the factories that left. And the factories that left Germany in the 60s were factories with a large number of employees, and that provided with good employment opportunities for lots of workers with limited education. And the factory that is coming back is an entirely automated production line where basically nobody's even touching the shoe. And of course, you will have security guards and a bunch of engineers and cleaning personnel or whatever. You also have construction workers helping build the factory in the first place. But essentially, this large-scale job opportunities for blue-collar workers are not going to materialize, really. And so now we are throwing a lot of money at these companies in order to bring production back. And I don't really have a view as to whether that is overall a good thing or a bad thing to do, because obviously there are benefits from having production located nearer to your consumers. There are benefits to having a high-tech sector being stimulated by local demand for high-tech products and services. So that's great. But at the same time, I think this mistaken understanding of modern production might be also biasing a little bit the policy discussions around these things, the kind of incentives that people are willing to vote for. So basically, we are throwing lots of money at these companies without necessarily realizing large-scale employment opportunities. Okay, this is just an aside, but as a behavioral scientist, I find the topic kind of interesting. Companies are making decisions about their operations in order to make their operations as efficient as possible, which they have to do in a competitive market. And what do consumers make of that? So we use a social contract account to try to explain consumer reactions to collective layoff decisions by firms. And social contracts are implicit promises that the parties cannot be enforced to respect, but are expected to respect. And the parties here typically mean government and citizens. There's a long tradition in philosophy of relying on the notion of social contracts to understand government and justice, back from the Enlightenment thinkers to 20th century thinkers like John Rawls. And this idea of a social contract has been used also in management theory, especially with regard to a stakeholder approach, for example, related to, say, sustainability or other things. So this famous book by Donaldson from '82 says, a social contract for business is not a typewritten contract in the real world, but a metaphysical abstraction, not unlike the social contract between citizens and government that philosophers have traditionally discussed. And so we think this is kind of an interesting idea. It's not being used in psychological research at all. This construct tends to be more of a broader philosophical notion, but we do think it might be useful to understand how consumers think about firm decisions. And what we argue is that collective layoffs, when a firm basically decides to lay off a chunk of workers all at once, are seen generally as a social contract violation. Social contracts are these give and take relationships. It's the reciprocal expectations about what you do for one another. And consumers are supporting firms with their tax money that fund infrastructure and education by buying the products. And in return, the company is expected to provide good products and safe products, but especially to provide employment opportunities. And so the moment that a firm decides to lay off a lot of workers, that we argue is likely seen as a social contract violation, like a violation of this implicit pact between a community and a firm. And by community here, we tend to conceptualize a community at the national state, at the nation state level, because this is the dominant unit of analysis in today's world. Of course, this might also be more local, regional, in countries like, say, Belgium, divided between Flanders and Wallonia. There might be also very strong, social contract constructions at the regional level. That may happen in other countries too, like Italy, for example. But generally speaking, the automatic frame of reference for anything to do with society or community nowadays tends to be the nation state. So that's what we focus on. And what we argue is that the extent to which consumers are negative about collective layoffs should be a function of internal attribution. That is, the extent to which I attribute the decision of the firm to lay off these workers to internal desires and will rather than external pressure and external forces. So, for example, in the law, we know that the extent to which a sentence is severe or not is to an important function a result of perceptions of intentionality. For example, if you kill a person by mistake, we call that manslaughter. If you kill a person intentionally, we call that murder, and you spend different years in jail as a result of which interpretation is made about your actions. And so we think that something like that is going on here too, where the consumers will be having more intense negative reactions when they increase the level of internal attribution. It's about the firm wanting to do this because of greed or because of whatever, rather than the environment forcing them to do this and therefore having to perform that behavior despite maybe their opposition to it. And so what we say is that the degree of internal versus external attribution will be a function of the reason being provided for a collective layoff. So given the same collective layoff, we argue that reaction should be more negative when attributions are more internal. And what we argue is that offshoring is a reason for a collective layoff that is likely to invite especially strong internal attributions. While other reasons, like automation, making the example of the Adidas factory before, or maybe declining demand, the business is not going well, those are reasons for a collective layoff that are easier to externalize. It's almost like in the case of automation and technology, AI and robotics and new tools like that, adoption by firm is almost seen as inevitable. The progress goes one direction, the technology is being invented, what is the firm to do but to adopt? And it is very bad that these people are fired, are losing their job, but hey, it is what it is. This is kind of what a mindset might look like for the case of automation. In the case of offshoring, that's not the case. If you decide to sack all your workers and move the factory to a developing economy far away, now you are performing a behavior that indicates internal will. You wanted to do it in order to, make more money or whatever. And that is seen as more negative. That's basically the gist of our argument. So our key hypothesis is that people will display more negative reactions to offshoring than to automation, holding constant the collective layoff event, and that this effect can be accounted for by perceptions of social contract violation. Okay? Now, as a note aside, I'll say that people have written about how negative people feel about offshoring decisions, but we haven't been able to find in the literature a causal test of this prediction. So while the hypothesis is not maybe surprising or counterintuitive, at present, we don't really have evidence for that. And the reason for this is that the few studies that we've seen tend to compare the status quo to the situation where the firm lays off workers and offshores. So in that comparison, you're now confounding actually two things, because you're confounding the event of laying off workers with the event of offshoring. They're occurring together compared to the control condition where nobody's being fired. And that comparison, therefore, is not a good test of how people feel about offshoring. And so we're trying to now create that first clean evidence of it. Okay. All right, so to summarize, what we do is to test these ideas. We compare consumer responses to the same collective layoff event as a function of why the layoff event is taking place. And we'll always compare offshoring to another reason. Most of the time, automation, because I think automation and offshoring are probably the most common kind of options the companies have. But we also compare it to other options, including internal relocation, outsourcing, and declining demand. And then what we do is that we make predictions about the moderators and mediators of this main effect based on our theory of social contracts, and we basically use it to assess the key assumptions of our model and to provide some insight into boundary conditions. And so we use location as a main device for our moderators. I'll explain in a minute what I mean by that. Okay, at this point, I'd like to just take a pause to ask if there are any questions or comments. All right, so I assume all clear. So I'm going to jump into the data. And just to show you the empirical package that we have part one is essentially a series of tests of the basic effect, this negative reactions to offshoring. And the red dot on the side indicates all the studies that are pre-registered. All the data is available online. We're happy to send you everything, the link to the Open Science Foundation package. So we start with an experimental study. Then we have another experimental study where we look at attitudes. And then we have two correlational observational studies, one based on social media content and one based on collective layoff events by the European Union. I'm not going to present that last one, but I think it's quite interesting source of data. So I'll share you 2 words on this in case you're interested. The European Union logs every collective layoff decision across the 27 members of the Union. And these are available on our website for a number of, basically for decades. And what they do is that for every collective layoff event, they indicate which company it was, from which industry, in which country. And they also, crucial for our purpose, they tell you why the collective layoff event happened. Many times the company went bankrupt, other times they relocated, automated, but quite a lot of times also they offshored production. And in addition to that, the European Commission staff write a report, about a page, where they describe basically the event and local reactions to the event. So typically they summarize what happened, what the unions did, and what the local media reported on and stuff like that. And so we take that text as a proxy for reactions to this event. And so we then apply a customer sentiment analysis algorithm to capture the valence of those descriptions. And then we test whether this valence is significantly different across different reasons provided for collective layoff, while controlling for size of the layoff, country in which the layoff would take place, the industry, and all of other things. And so that's just a cool data set, actually, that you can access for free very easily through the web. Okay, so this is part one, just a basic effect, negative reactions to offshoring. Then we have part two. And what we do in part two is that we have quite a long series of studies which we try to get at the psychological process. And so we have a bunch of ways in which we do that. We try to provide insights into the role of social contract violation. A couple of studies look at this notion of internal attribution that I mentioned earlier. And then a bunch of others instead moderate and mediate the effect by implicating social contract violation, either through measurement, that is mediation, or through moderation, that is we find boundary conditions and moderators that are informed by the theory. And I'll tell you a little bit more about those. In the process of testing for the process, psychological process, we're also trying to rule out alternative explanations, because this is quite a rich phenomenon, and one can come up with quite a few hypotheses for why consumers might react negatively to a offshoring event. So we account for social norms, for ethnocentrism, patriotism, authenticity, product quality, and affinity for technology across a variety of studies, just to make sure that we can rule out at the outset through design or control statistically through measurement for the possible role of these other processes. Okay, I'm not going to go into much detail on that, but it's in the paper if you're interested. Okay, so this is the whole series. Obviously, we have about 20 minutes left. I am not going to present you with all of these studies. I thought I'd pick a couple just to give you a sense for the kind of evidence. And so the first one is an experimental study called the sock study. This is actually a picture of my sock drawer. And what we do here is that we have an incentivized choice design where panel workers are asked to read about the description of 2 sock brands, and they're told that at the end of the studies, a number of winners will receive a $20, $25 voucher for the brand that they have chosen in the study. So in that sense, it's incentivized because hopefully they want to really choose a brand that they like, as they have a chance of receiving a voucher for that sock brand. And then we describe 2 brands, and we provide them with some visual cues and some generic information about these brands. And the key thing is that, and that's maybe somewhat unusual, but for each of the 2 brands that they have to choose from, we provide also a negative piece of information. For the control brand, that piece of information is always the same. And it is some information about their recently encountered problems with customer service. And for the target brand, we always tell them that this brand has recently laid off some workers at their production site in the United States. And what we do then is that we randomly vary between participants the reason provided for that collective layoff event. And for half of the participants, we tell them it's because of offshoring. And for half of the people, we tell them it's because of automation. And what we can do now, we can monitor the choice share between the 2 brands and see whether that queue, that offshoring versus automation queue, shifts that choice share of the target brand up or down between the 2 conditions. Okay, so that's basically the logic of the study. And then ultimately they choose, and then they get the brief, and that's it. And so what I'm showing you basically now is the choice share. And in the automation condition, we find that about just over a quarter of participants choose the target brand, the brand that had the laid off workers. So that number in isolation doesn't mean very much, because, why is it below 50%? Maybe because people really dislike layoff events, or maybe because the picture of the socks of the other brand was more attractive. We don't know, and it doesn't matter. What it does matter is how that black pie slice changes in size in the other condition, where we tell them that the layoff event was motivated by offshoring. And what we find there is that the choice share collapses to just over 10%. So we have over half halving of the choice share in the 2 conditions. So this is the first evidence that I know that controlling for control clean evidence of negative reactions to offshoring. Okay, so this is a causal study, an experiment. I'm going to show you now perhaps more interesting observational data. We collected this data on Reddit, well-known social media platform where hundreds of millions of people basically are posting ideas and comments in different subreddits or different communities. And what we did was to scrape posts that related to either automation or offshoring. And so we found from a first scrape over 1,000. What we did was to pre-register the scraping algorithm, the Python code. We also pre-registered the inclusion criteria for the post. And based on the application of those inclusion criteria, we narrowed down the final set of posts to 674. The reason for that is that quite a lot of offshoring posts were nothing to do with the collective layoffs, but had to do with offshoring energy production, like offshore energy or offshore finance and stuff like that. So we basically kicked those out, and we kept only those that had to do with the collective layoffs. And then now that we have this set of 674 posts, what we do is that we scrape all the comments below those posts. And so we have data sets of almost 30,000 comments. And then what we do is that we apply a sentiment analysis algorithm called Vader to try to gauge the valence of those comments. Okay? So now we have posts that vary as to whether they relate to collective layoff and automation or collective layoffs and offshoring. And we have tens of thousands of posts, and for each of them, comments, and for each of them, we have a number from -1 to +1, which tells us how negative or positive those comments were. Then we run a regression model. And so the pre-registered model is the first one. We find a negative effect of offshoring. So the sentiment is more negative for for comments and the post related to offshoring. And this is what we predicted. And then we run a series of additional regression models trying to account for potential alternative explanations. For example, different subreddits are different communities. Different communities may have different social norms as to how positive their comments tend to be. And if posts about offshoring tend to gravitate towards subreddits that have a more negative social norm for post-valence, then you might get this effect just because of the people who are commenting. So we're trying to, and we have a bunch of explanations like that. As much as we can, we try to control for this. And the negative effect of offshoring remains significant across all models. We do another thing, which is, this was something that was mentioned by reviewers. How do you know that these are negative reactions to offshoring instead of positive reactions to automation? Automation, the tech is cool. People might find it kind of cool, robots or whatever. And so maybe actually this is a positive reaction to offshoring, to automation. Now, we never thought that was likely because these are all posts about collective layoff decisions. So they're not happy posts about automation and cool, gimmicky kind of robots. But there is a point there. So what we did was to scrape a random sample of Reddit posts. So we just picked posts from Reddit, a sample, to create a similar kind of sample size, and then we tested the difference. And what we find is that the collective layoff, the balance of comments about collective layoffs tend to be more negative in both automation and offshoring cases than the control post, but they're more negative for the offshoring ones than the automation ones. So that seems to confirm that it's really more of a negative reaction to offshoring than a positive one to automation. Okay. So that's a Reddit post. And then let me now share a couple of studies about the psychological process. And so first, just to explain the logic of this. So we said we have a social contract account. A social contract account means that we have reciprocal expectation for appropriate behavior on the side of both the community, intended at the nation-state level, and on the side of the firm. And so you can start playing with the magnitude of that negative effect of offshoring by modulating the strength of the social contract. Because if the social contract changes in intensity and expectations, you'd expect, if that account is correct, that also the negative effect to offshoring should also respond accordingly. Okay, so we do a couple of things. And the first one is to say, well, if there is no social contract between my community and this particular firm, or this particular layoff event does not occur in a condition that makes me think about the social contract at all, then you should not expect any effect of offshoring. You don't expect this negative effect at all. So we start with that. And the way we do it is a study that you can call the Not My Workers study. And so what we do is that basically we make the layoff event take place in a faraway place and see what people do then. We try to keep a lot of things constant as much as we can. So we use a country that has somehow similar quality expectations and culture as the United States. We select Australia for that. And so these are American respondents that read about a collective layoff event that either takes place in the United States or in Australia, and takes place either because of automation or offshoring. Okay, and then now we have a 2x2 experimental design where people are randomly assigned to one of the 4 cells, and we can measure attitude towards the firm. In this study and a bunch of other studies, what we do is that we provide a fairly generic description, not very short. We provide some context, but we make it fairly generic about an industrial group. So this is clearly a fairly large industrial group active in a series of different sectors, and now to make this decision laying off people. In some studies, we just give them a description. In some studies, we embed the description in a journal, in a newspaper article. So we make a mock newspaper page, say from The Guardian or whatever, and we basically edit the text to manipulate our construct. But basically, we just make them read this description and let them rate attitude toward the firm. Very simple scale, standard, how positive you feel about the firm. And what we find is that we produce a significant interaction, this 2x2 design. If you look at the American condition, now the offshoring, the layoff event takes place in the United States, and these are American participants. That negative effect is quite clear. As you can see, the attitudes towards the firm are lower when they were in the condition where the company offshored production than when they were in the condition where the company automated production. And so that negative effect is a replication of the 2 studies that I showed you before they were in a choice and a social media balance, kind of dependent variable. This time we do it with an attitude dependent variable, but the pattern is exactly the same. Now, the interesting thing here is that we do not find that effect when the layoff event happens in Australia. So now these are not my workers. I don't have, that community is a different community, not mine. And all of a sudden we just don't care. So it doesn't matter whether they offshore or automate. Obviously, attitudes are not very positive. The scale goes from 1 to 7. Nobody particularly enjoys a company that lays off workers. So the scores are overall rather low. But if you look at the 4 cells, there is really one cell that stands out, which is the offshoring cell on the home market. And then the rest is kind of the same. Okay. So this is the first initial evidence for the assumptions of our model. But then there's another way to think about it and say, okay, rather than say, okay, these are not my workers, let's think about they are my workers. But in different situations, the stringency of the social contract may be different. Sometimes the social contract may be very strong, expectations may be very high for behavior, and other times may be a little lower. And so what we argue is that if you weaken the strength of the social contract, the negative effect of offshoring should also be weakened. So how would you do it? Well, you can play with factors on both sides of the social contract. You can weaken the social contract by, kind of lowering expectations of firm behavior because the community didn't behave the way that maybe it should, or you can do the other way. You can weaken the social contract by changing the community's expectation about firm behavior by changing some factors around the firm. And so what we do both. And in particular, we look at, like I mentioned, location kind of factors. In the case of the community, we look at customer location. So we describe a firm that lays off workers and moves production overseas. And in 2 different conditions, we tell them that either this company has all the customers abroad or all the customers in the home market. And what we find is that negative reactions to offshoring are weaker where local consumers do not support the company by buying the products. So when the customers are all abroad, then offshoring production is seen as a less egregious behavior than when all the customers are in the home market. Okay, so I'm not going to show you the study, but I'm going to show you the second one, which is about the headquarter location. What we argue there is that if the company is originally from a different country, coming here to establish a business presence and opening a factory, if that firm decides to move production overseas, that behavior is seen as less negative, less objectionable than if that was originally a domestic company that had been there forever. Okay? That almost like saying, if you've always been in our community, we hold the standards a little higher than if you were a foreign company who came here to do business. So I'm going to show you one of these studies. It's called the headquarters study, the HQ study. And here they read, again, a generic description of an industrial group, and the industrial group lays off people. And then we manipulate between participants in a 2x2 design, whether the reason for layoff is offshoring or automation. We also manipulate whether the headquarter location is the United States or a generic overseas. In different studies, we change things. Sometimes we keep it vague. Sometimes we give a particular country, trying to basically test robustness by trying different approaches. The results are quite robust. And so here again, you see the kind of the same shape of interaction that I showed you before. In the case of the domestic headquarter company, we find again the negative effect of offshoring, replicating the findings from the previous studies. But when the headquarter is foreign, now we don't find a significant effect. We see a tendency towards a negative effect of offshoring, but it's not very strong. And the interaction overall is significant. So here is a moderator that informs you of the fact that if you change variable around the firm that reduces the expectation of the customer that the company should really support the local community, then you find the weaker responses to offshoring. Okay, so we have replications of this results with also mediation and other benchmarks. We also compare it to declining demand, which is also very easy to externalize. Clearly, the company is not doing well, and also maybe they need to shut down the factory or whatever. And so we find something similar there. What I want to do, I just want to conclude, and then we have a few minutes for questions. So I want to, what I'm interested most about this project to me is that I think it tells something interesting about what you can call lay people economics and how people believe the economic system works or should work. And so if you think about a firm operating in a competitive market, they have to try to become efficient, because if they don't, they'll go out of business. And so how do you become more efficient? Well, you can become more efficient in many ways, but the most obvious ones is to leverage the opportunities that are offered by the two biggest forces that shape business. And one is globalization, and one is technology. So if you become more efficient by leveraging the opportunities offered by globalization, what you're trying to do essentially is to reduce your variable cost by moving production where labor costs are lower. Okay? And so you have this labor arbitrage opportunity, you end up offshoring your production. If you instead leverage the opportunity offered by technology, what you're trying to do is to replace expensive variable cost in the shape of salaries with capital investments in the shape of machines, essentially. And so now I'm trying to buy all these robots so I don't have to pay all these people to do the work. Now, while in many ways the impact on the community is similar, these people lose a job, what we find in this paper is that technology and globalization are not seen in the same way, and that the legitimacy of efficiency is a function of whether the firm is leveraging globalization or technology, and that the firms are penalized more when their efforts to become more efficient are leveraging globalization than when they instead leveraging technology. It's almost like saying firms that lay off workers because of technological adoption are given more leeway, more license than firms that instead take a similar decision, but instead are leveraging the opportunities offered by globalization. I find that theme of the legitimacy of efficiency quite interesting, and I think it tells us something about how people feel about technology and how much tech companies might be able to get away, perhaps with behaviors that the other firms might not be able to get away with. Get away by meaning in terms of public opinion. So that's basically the message of the talk, and it was just one example of the kind of work that we can do at the boundary between economics, technology, and psychology. And I hope you find it interesting. I have that was my last slide. I'm going to stop the presentation, and then we have a few minutes for discussion.